Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bulldog Breakdown. I'm your host, as always, James Lavasser. We have a pretty exciting episode today, as always, and we have the Massachusetts State Senator, John Keenan. John, it is a pleasure to have you here on the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I just have a few questions for you. It should be pretty easy.
Sure.
Alrighty. So the first one I have for you is you've been in office for a long time. What do you say to people who feel progress has been too slow on key issues like housing and mental health?
I agree with them. It's been a slow, especially on those two topics and others as well. But we definitely have a housing crisis right now. We need to build more housing units, and the frustration is that it takes so long to get things, permits and so forth, approved. And so we've got to find a way to speed that up so that we can get more housing, and that will help kind of moderate housing prices. I'm not so sure housing prices will fall, but the more that you can build, the more housing you can put on the market, that should moderate the prices, slow down the increases in the price of housing. And that's important for your generation. You're very active and involved at your school and in your community, and I would hope that you want to live here or in this area. We'd love to have you stay in Massachusetts. So we have to make sure that you can afford to stay here. And then on mental health, it's taken a long time to kind of get the infrastructure that we need in place, meaning places for treatment, access to those treatment programs, outpatient treatment programs, access to qualified mental health providers, whether they be social workers or psychiatrists, whatever it may be. So we have to make sure that we have that in place, and a lot of that comes down to insurance coverage as well. And we find that in the last several years, it seems that the mental health situation, some call it a crisis, has worsened, that we're living in very interesting times. We're coming out of COVID, and as we try to figure all that out, people are struggling more than they have in the past, and we haven't been able to meet their needs. And so in both those areas, yes, it's taken too long, but we continue to move things forward, and I think we've had some improvements in both of those areas, but there's still a lot more work to do.
How are you making sure that tax dollars are being spent fairly and effectively?
We just went through our budget process, and the way it works is the governor introduces a budget early in the calendar year for the fiscal year that starts July 1st. And then the House of Representatives takes and introduces their version of the budget in April, and then the Senate constructs a budget and introduces that in May. So we just went through that process last week. We had a budget proposal. There were 1,058 amendments, I think, to the budget proposal. And so in the course of all of that, you really get to the point where you prioritize certain things and you realize that you can't do everything and you leave others behind. There's so much more that we could be doing, but we just don't have the resources. We have to, unlike the federal government, here in Massachusetts, we have to have a balanced budget. Our revenues cannot be less than what we spend. There has to be balanced. And so that puts a fiscal restraint on us. If our revenues drop, either from taxes that people pay, or if our revenues from the federal government drop, then we have to adjust our budget accordingly. Right now, even though we've passed our Senate budget, and members of the Senate will meet with members of the House of Representatives to make sure that we come up with a budget that represents both bodies, that's then sent off to the governor. As we go through that process, there's a real concern about whether the revenues from the federal government will be there to support the budget that we're now working on.
Okay, and some people feel politicians only show up during elections. How do you stay connected to your district year-round?
Well, thank you for doing this. This is one way that we do it. We do regular office hours. By that, we mean we put word out on social media through our newsletter that we will be in the towns to meet with people. So we do these rotations, and one rotation may be that we go to the senior centers in every town, and we do those during the day. So we'd put notice out that we're going to be at the senior center, and people can come by, talk to us about individual matters, or talk to us about bigger matters. So we go town by town into senior centers, and that's considered a round of office hours. And then after that, we would do a round of nighttime office hours for people who can't get to those during the day. And we usually hold those either at a library or a town hall. Same thing, we publicize that, and then people can come and discuss an individual or a bigger issue. Also, if somebody calls the office and wants to discuss something, pretty regularly I'll say, okay, let's meet. For instance, today I met with somebody at the library in Quincy. Over the last 2 weeks, I think we've been to the library here in Rockland, I think twice, or maybe over the last month, 2 or 3 times perhaps, meeting with people at the library because they wanted to, it was convenient for them. So we'll come down and meet one-on-one in the library. We send out a newsletter to constituents once a month, and in that newsletter we talk about what we've done, but also have contact information for them to reach out. And we're pretty active on our social media, and we do get responses to that. And then we get a lot of people who call the office or email the office, and we take a lot of pride in my office that we get right back to them. I was in Hanover, which is in my district, on Memorial Day early in the morning at Troop 38's annual breakfast, and a woman said, I called your office, and somebody picked up the phone, they took a message, and that afternoon I got a call right back. And she says, that doesn't always work with other offices. And so we take a lot of pride in that, and I'm very lucky that whether it's office hours, responding to emails, responding to telephone calls, meeting with people, I have a really good team in place, and together we are responsive to people, and that allows them to share with me their concerns about what's going on at local level, state level, or even the federal level.
So you're always making sure that you're getting back to people.
Absolutely. That's the most important part of our job. You can respond to somebody and agree with them on something, and that's great if you don't respond to them. And you can disagree with them as well. They might write on a certain matter and we'll convey. We have a process in the office where I'll see the email typically, and then somebody in the office will kind of ask me a question about it. They'll do a draft, and then I finalize the draft. I do a lot of redlining, and then we send the draft out, and we agree with people or disagree with them. And usually that's fine. People say, thanks for writing back. I don't agree with you on this, but I appreciate your response. It's when you don't respond that people get frustrated and start to lose faith in government and the people that serve in government.
Next topic, I just have 2 questions about immigration. Is
Sure.
that fine with you? All right.
Sure.
So the first one I have is, many residents feel that undocumented immigrants are straining local resources like housing and schools. Do you feel that state tax dollars should be used to provide housing, food, and legal aid to people who are here illegally?
I do, and here's why. If we don't, then people will be sleeping in our parks and our playgrounds. They will be going to our hospitals to just stay in the emergency departments, and we've seen that. We've seen them show up at hospitals because they have nowhere else to go. We've seen them looking for food because they had nowhere else to go. And so we can't control as a state the border. And if the border was such that people were coming across into the country and ended up in Massachusetts, we did not have the ability to stop that, nor do we have the financial ability or perhaps even the legal authority to put them on a plane and send them home or wherever they may have come from. So once they got here, we had a choice. We can just let them come here and do nothing. And again, they show up at the emergency departments. They end up sleeping in the parks and the playgrounds, sleeping at the airport, sleeping wherever. And in fact, in Quincy, which is in my district, we had babies sleeping outside the Wallaston train station at night. And so those are the choices. So we can choose to have adults and children living on the streets, showing up at emergency departments, sleeping outside MBTA train stations, or we can find a way to get them through the moment. And it was expensive. It was very expensive, but the decision was made that we'll do the humanitarian thing. It's beyond our control how they got here, but we'll do the humanitarian thing and make sure that at least that they have a roof over their heads and some food in their stomach. And it was expensive. We're at the stage now where the number of people coming into the system has dropped dramatically, and we saw that trend over the last year or more. The numbers coming in, they peaked in August of 2023, I think it was, or in the fall of 2023. It slowed down through 24, and particularly then in August of 2024, it really started to drop off. And now, and at one point, several months ago, we had more Massachusetts residents in our emergency housing program than we did people from other countries. And so that's really dropped off. And we still provide housing to the residents of Massachusetts. We provide them with meals. They may have come into our system because of domestic violence, that they've been kicked out of a house, or we find that people's rents have gone up so much that people can't afford rent and they end up on the streets. That's an increasing problem here with seniors. And so we tried to find a way to meet the needs of all of them. And we did spend a lot of money on migrants, but we also spend an awful lot of money, as we need to, for longtime citizens of Massachusetts. I often heard that, well, we weren't providing programming for veterans. That's not true. We have the best veterans benefits in the entire United States. And if you ask anybody who's involved in the veteran services organizations, and every community has a veteran service agent, you ask them about the benefits we provide, and we provide the absolute best. And we wanted to make sure that we continued that, and we did, even while we were kind of struggling financially to make sure that we could put a roof over the head and food in the stomachs of the migrants. We hear that, oh, we're not helping the homeless in Massachusetts while we were helping the migrants. That's not true either. We spend a lot of money with programming to shelter people, to get them food, and then also to give them job training efforts to basically get them back on their feet so that they can re-enter the workforce and then get their own housing. So there's a lot of talk about, well, we're paying for for migrants and not covering the things we should for anybody else. We were able to do each one of those things. A lot of the money that we spent on the migrants was money that had been set aside through some federal money for those types of purposes. We had kind of a separate account for that. And so our regular operating budget, we were able to continue on with what we were doing and to provide that funding that helped the migrants. It was a big undertaking, and we could have used that money somewhere else, but ultimately we got through it, and we just have to continue to make sure that we provide the basics to people. I mean, I went down to the Wallaston train station one of the nights that they were out there, and it breaks your heart to see these little babies sleeping outside of a train station. And so we always have to keep in mind that beyond all the rhetoric, all the words, all the talk, that these are real people, they're human beings, and so many of them are just children. And I think we have an obligation as humans to care for other humans.
Well, do you feel that there should be like a vote on like where they go? Like, for instance, my next question, do you feel that there should be a vote for residents and officials in small towns on whether undocumented immigrants can reside in the town? In addition, should the residents and officials have a vote on whether they are a sanctuary city?
Yeah, so to the first one, whether they should reside in a town, that's really difficult to enforce. It's unclear what residency might mean. If somebody wants to come in and buy a home and they're undocumented, they're not going to be able to. They're not going to be able to get the financing to do it. Even if they have cash, there's forms that they have to fill out to show what their taxpayer identification numbers are. So if residing in a town means buying a home, then that's really not going to happen. If it means being in a motel in a town, such as the situation here in Rockland, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for the town to weigh in on that because the state was just in such a quick response mode, and there were some concerns justified in the town as to what having people in the motel would mean to the school system. And I know the Rockland town officials made it very clear to us that there was a financial strain, and so the state tried to respond with an increase in the amount of money that's provided to the school system for each one of the migrants that was in the school system. It wasn't enough, but there was an attempt to cover that. So it was trying to find the balance, and I do know that towns felt like they should have had more say. If towns had, if every town had said no, though, I don't know what we would have done. Then you would have had people, again, sleeping in parks and playgrounds and hospitals and bank lobbies or wherever they may have been. And in terms of a sanctuary city, there's really no legal definition of a sanctuary city. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. There's a belief that if you're a sanctuary city, that means that if somebody commits an illegal act, that they're not prosecuted. That's just not true. If somebody who's a U.S. citizen comes in and robs a bank, or somebody who's who's here without documentation, a migrant, illegal, whatever phrase you want to use, if they go rob a bank, regardless, they're arrested. They're brought into court. and they are put through the court process in the same way. And then when it just becomes a decision as to ultimately are they deported or are they locked up. But they don't, if you're here without documentation, you just can't walk in a bank, rob the bank, get caught, try to rob the bank and get caught and say, oh, we're a sanctuary city and nothing happens to you. That's just not accurate. One of the things that does come up is whether local law enforcement should cooperate with the federal government. Most of the police departments in the Commonwealth, and I know the ones in my district, if they arrest somebody and they fingerprint them, that information goes to the federal government. They do that as a matter of course. So that information is shared. And then if the federal government, based on that, wants to detain somebody, or if there's an outstanding felony charge or some criminal charge against a person, then the federal government will come in and say, we'll take that person. So all of that does occur. The question is whether local law enforcement cooperates with the federal government in perhaps detaining somebody or bringing somebody into custody. And I was just did an interview just right before this on a situation that occurred in Quincy. I was driving by a stop where I believe, I don't know for certain, but I believe it was the federal government had pulled somebody over and taken them into custody. And as I drove by, there were individuals wearing face coverings. One of them had a vest that said police. None of the vehicles were marked as police vehicles, so you didn't know whether they were police. And as I pulled up to a stop sign and looked over, one of these people was staring at me. And I looked back, and the person continued to stare at me. I went up to the stop sign and looked over again, and the person continued to stare at me. And I looked back, and we kind of locked eyes. And then I went to the stop sign to go on my way, and I got up about 25 yards, and there's like a triangle in the area. And this is an area pretty close to where I grew up. I knew all the families that lived literally in the houses right where this stop occurred. So I pulled around and just wound down my window and very politely said to the 4 or 5 people that were there, still wearing face coverings, no idea where they were from. I did see there was a license plate on one of the vehicles that was from Michigan. And I just said to the person, I said, I really didn't appreciate the stare down. And the person said something which I can't repeat here, very vulgar. He swore at me, used the F word, and I didn't even know what it meant. And I looked it up, and it's pretty incredible what he said. And it included an F word twice. And so I said, well, what agency are you with? In that exact tone, no response. And I said, well, I didn't appreciate the stare down, and I went on my way. And so when you talk about cooperating with the federal government, I know the offices in the communities that I represent and offices all across the state. They're well-trained. They work really hard. I don't want to put them in a position where they have to wear face coverings, where they're unidentified, where they don't have to say whether they're police officers or not, and where they treat citizens that way. All the police officers that I know in the communities that I represent, and again across the Commonwealth, they don't talk like that to citizens. They don't wear face coverings. They wear a badge, even if they're plain clothes, a badge that identify with a badge number on it. They identify themselves as working for a certain police department. When they're asked, they'll identify what police department they work for. They don't treat people the way that the federal, I assume these were federal agents, I don't even know. And I don't want to put our police officers into that situation. It's unfair to them. We pay our local tax dollars for local law enforcement to prioritize things within our communities. They have good relationships with the people of the communities. I don't think we should be using local law enforcement dollars to participate in the behavior that we're seeing from the federal government and ICE agents. And they've got a job to do. And I'm not questioning what their job is. I'm questioning how they are doing it. And to see in my neighborhood, in our city of Quincy where I grew up, these people wearing face coverings, unidentified, talking the way they talk to a citizen who is polite, I just don't think that that's acceptable. And so when you talk about should we cooperate with the federal government or not, I would say why should we put our police officers in that situation? Our police officers do a really good job, and it would be unfair to them to have them have to witness that or participate in that.
Because that's not what they're for. They're supposed to be. They're not supposed to be covering themselves, hiding who they are, where they're from. They're supposed to be open because they want people to go for them to help and stuff like that. So like
Right.
they're not there to be all mean and like hiding who they are. They're supposed to be open and a sign for if you need help, I'm here.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about mental health. With so many of the departments in my district, which is Quincy, Braintree, Abington, Rockland, Holbrook, and Hanover, those departments have now mental health clinicians within the department. So it's not just like they're going to go out and arrest people. If somebody's struggling and the police have to respond, the police departments send an officer, and then they have somebody that has a mental health background, and together they address the situation. They're not just in there to arrest; they're there to help, to be, to beyond protecting. They're there to serve and to help people. And every department in my district does it that way. And so, to have them participate in the behavior that we've seen from the federal government and that I've seen firsthand in one of my communities is one of the communities that I'm lucky enough to represent. It's I don't want to do that to the officers.
All right, thank you for answering those questions. My next topic is about sports betting and the Bettor Health Act, which I know is a topic that you like to talk about. My first question is, what are the biggest harms you've seen from sports betting so far?
There are financial harms. Just heard yesterday from a woman who works in a local community, and she was contacted by two parents, and one parent conveyed that they had a child who had gotten involved in sports betting and owed $7,000. And then a separate parent reached out and kind of shared a similar story, and that their son owed $11,000 as a result of sports betting. So that's a lot of money. So there's that financial impact on the family. The family will have to figure out how they handle that. And then there's the impact for those two young people. What's next for them? And the parents just want to straighten this out to try to get them on the path. They're both ready to go to college, to get them to the point where they can get this behind them and go to college. And so there's a chance that if it's not straightened out or worked out, or they aren't ready for college because of what's happened, that they're going to miss out on their emotional growth. They're going to miss out on growing up. So there's financial impacts. Then there are those type of impacts that will result in young people not being able to grow up in a kind of traditional way. They're going to have this issue of owing money or worried about who they owe money to or how they're going to get that money. Beyond that, whether it's young people or adults, it is addictive, and people are becoming addicted to sports betting. In a lot of ways, it's no different than being addicted to an opioid, to alcohol, to nicotine. The experts will tell you that it hits the same receptor in the brain. That's the same reward receptor.
Exactly. They like that rush.
They like that rush.
And they win. They think they can do it again.
Exactly. And they get addicted to that. And then in a worst case scenario, and this is, unfortunately it happens, it's tough to document, but a lot of people contemplate or try suicide, and people try suicide and succeed. And so it's, and then beyond, getting to that ultimate, the worst case scenario, what happens to somebody in the meantime? Well, they maybe steal from work, steal from family, embezzle money, commit fraud, go out and commit theft to support their addiction. And it sounds like, that can't be happening. It is happening. And then you have the point where they miss work, and so employers are losing out on productivity. You have the point where then they spiral down, and they may end up, with needing some behavioral health, some mental health care, and that's expensive to society as a whole. So there's cost at every level, and we're trying to figure that out and to prevent those costs and to protect people from harming themselves through addictive behavior. So that's the goal behind it. We're really concerned about young people. We are hearing more and more that it's a problem in middle schools and in high schools, and that young people don't think it's that big of an issue. Oh, I'm just betting a few dollars here or there. But for some of those that manage to do that, there are some that are really developing addiction issues, and they can cover it up for quite a while, but ultimately it catches up with them. So we're really concerned about young people because the studies show, whether it's marijuana, alcohol, opioids, that if they get to young people, they kind of have them for a long time. And that's what the industries are planning on, that if they can get a 15, 16, 17-year-old, maybe not betting, but engaging on a platform that's an awful lot like a sports betting platform.
Being exposed to it.
Being exposed. You don't even have to bet money, but you get rewards for if you win. And then when they turn of age, all of a sudden now they're on the platforms and they're betting money. And so the industry is bringing people along because they know that for every 100 people that they get to try this, they may get 3, 4, 6, or 7 that end up betting a lot of money, that end up being problem gamblers and then addicted gamblers. And that's where the industry, the studies show, make most of their money. So we're concerned about people of all ages and what the industry is doing in terms of targeting them. We're particularly concerned about young people. And if anybody, here or anywhere else, wants to talk about it, we're happy to talk with them about it. If they've got a short story that they want to share, or a parent wants to tell us about what's going on, we need those stories to help people realize that this is a big problem. And then the bill that we filed focuses on some of the behavior of the sports betting industry. So let's say that a person, an 18-year-old kid who's not supposed to even be on a platform, and we know that they can register like that. We had an intern in our office who showed us how quickly he could set up an account and bet, just like that, underage, but could do it very easily. So we find that the industry knows that that's going on, but they're not doing anything about it. We also find that when somebody is betting and then says to themselves, maybe I'm betting too much, and stops, the industry reaches out to them and says, haven't heard from you for a while. We'll give you double bonus points if you bet. We'll give you, extra, cash credits in your account if you bet. And they lure them right back in. And I use as an example, we had an opioid crisis where people went into recovery. We have people who struggle with alcoholism. Imagine if they were in a treatment program where they had stopped drinking or stopped using an opioid, and they're in a treatment program, they're in recovery, and somebody's knocking on their door saying, hey, come on, I'll give you free pills, or I'll give you free drinks. Come on, drink on us. We wouldn't allow it. And yet, it's perfectly legal for these sports betting companies to reach out to people who maybe have a gambling problem and say, we want you back. We want you to spend even more money. And that's just terrible. So there's a bunch of different things in the bill, but we're trying to really not say no to sports betting, but to make the industry
limitations on it.
Exactly. To put guardrails, some limitations, to have them act responsibly. They say, oh, we have responsible gambler programs so that people who are betting, they can bet responsibly. Well, I think that the industry should be more responsible because if somebody is betting and gets addicted, the industry kind of turns and says, well, they weren't responsible. They blame the person. Never mind that they were flooding them with emails and telephone calls or whatever it takes to reach out to them to say, come on back, start betting again. I've met with people who found themselves in that situation. One guy, he had stopped, was in recovery. They kept reaching out to him, and he relapsed. And what they enticed him with was front row tickets to a Philadelphia 76ers game, and he got to go on court and meet Joel Embiid, the star of the Sixers. And his wife was with him, and she said, how did all this happen? He said, well, I relapsed, and the betting companies paid for this. And he felt terrible, and he had to struggle again to try to get back on path. I talked to a young father who couldn't watch a sporting event with his son because of all the advertising that goes on. I talked to a young mother who said, I would get my kids tucked into bed, and then I'd be on my phone right away betting. And so it cuts all across. College athletes who would tell the story that they were playing in a game, and then in between periods, were in the locker room checking their phone to see how bets were going. And one said, if you asked me the score of the game I was playing in, I wouldn't be able to tell you. All I wanted to do was get in that locker room and see how my bets were going. So it affects everybody, and we're just trying to make the industry be more responsible and not take advantage of people.
Do you think they can still, the industry can still use the excuse they weren't responsible, even if they're not reaching out? So, even if, someone quits and then, they decide to relapse, even if the industry isn't reaching out to them, can they still use the excuse, they weren't responsible, even though they didn't,
Yeah, and ultimately it comes down to people, making decisions. But as you proceed down the path of becoming dependent on sports betting, dependent on alcohol, dependent on opioids, as you go down that path through dependency to the point where you're addicted, you lose your ability to exercise reasonable judgment. You lose the ability to say yes or no. Your addiction is telling you that you have to feed that addiction. And so, yeah, I guess it would be on me whether I decide to bet for the first time, or the second time, or the third time. Yes, I guess that's on me. But as time goes on, and the industry knows, they track everybody. They know who's betting a lot. And instead of saying, oh, they're betting too much, something's going on here, we should tell them slow down or you should stop for a while, they encourage it. And so when somebody starts to lose the control as they go through dependency to addiction and ultimately lose control of it, the industry is right there just pulling them in, getting more money out of them, getting them to bet more without considering what it's doing to the individual and to that individual's family.
What do you say about like I use sports teams as an example. Like I'm watching like a sports games and I'll see like on the sidelines there'll be an ad for a betting site or company. What do you say about that? Do you think sports teams should be able to, endorse these companies or?
No. I think that's where the real, that's advertising. Part of the bill is to make sure that the advertising is responsible, and that if you know there's going to be a young audience at a game or watching on TV, that you just can't advertise as you wish. You've got to be mindful of that audience, and if it reaches a certain percentage, then you can't advertise there because you're hitting young people. So I do think there should be restrictions on advertising. I think the other restriction should be that you can't convey to somebody that, you can't lose. It's no sweat. Can't lose. Play with our money. Those are all just designed to entice people into betting, and then off they go. And so those types of things, I think the industry does have to be more responsible on.
So do you think like those teams should be held responsible? So say like someone got really into betting and then they're like, oh, well, I saw an ad in a basketball game. Do you think that that team, that organization should also be held responsible for what's happening?
Yeah, I don't think they should. There's a real conflict. So people go to a game expecting the game to be on the up and up, that there's an integrity to the game, that every athlete's going to play the best that they can on behalf of themselves and on behalf of their team and representing the league and being fair to the fans, giving the fans a good product. What we've seen lately is that there are athletes who are not doing that, and it's impacting the integrity of the game. So I think it's important for the leagues to realize you can't be promoting this at the same time that players are being impacted by it, either by participating in behavior that they shouldn't be, meaning kind of fix their own performance, or just having the players impacted by fans who have bet on the games. And so we've had in the NBA, for instance, a player who people bet on him, and he knew it. And I can't remember what it was. He was supposed to, it was based on a certain number of points and minutes per game. So he put himself into the game, and when he got close to those numbers, he pretended he had an eye injury and took himself out of the game. And so the people that had bet the big money on what he would do won. And he knew it. And then I don't know if it was the next game or another game where he told the coach, I can't play, my eyes bother me, because there had been money on him. He was kicked out of the league. And so that's happened with in baseball. It's happened in basketball, college basketball. There's a couple investigations that are going on right now. And so that impacts the integrity of the game. The idea of just watching a game for enjoyment, you really can't, because you don't know what's going on. It's who's doing what. And so, but at the same time, these teams make a lot of money through the sports betting. You see it advertised in the arenas. They get money for the statistics that they own. So there's so much money in play, and there's real conflicts. And so we've got to try to figure that out. The biggest concern is, from a sports thing overall, is will the games be corrupted? And there's some signs that it's happening. And we're seeing some professional athletes push back. There was a Red Sox player who on social media kind of went at people because apparently, based on his performance, people on social media were kind of threatening to him. Jaylen Brown on a podcast talked about basically being confronted after a game by somebody who said, hey, you didn't cover my bet tonight. And he said, I'm not going to stand for that. So we've had NCAA, which makes a lot of money off of this, too, is my understanding. They are worried about people placing individual bets on their athletes and then athletes going to class or on campus and being abused by others saying, why didn't you hit that free throw? There are reports of people coming out of the stands and going down behind the benches and yelling at the coaches and the players, what, you can't hit a free throw? Why'd you put that person in to shoot the free throw? All those types of things. So it's spinning out of control.
So the Bettor Health Act, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is a bill that would crack down on sports betting by adding stricter rules, higher taxes, and more protections to help prevent gambling addiction, especially in young people. What was the need? Why did you feel the need to implement this?
I was hearing, first we heard when sports betting was legalized, I heard from people all the time about the advertising, saying it's just everywhere. It's way too much. It's on billboards. It's on TV. It's on the radio. It's on your phone. Everywhere you go, there's sports betting advertising. It was even pasted on barrels in Boston, sports betting. And so that's what we heard from people at first, and so we filed a bill to address the advertising. And then I started to hear from people saying, my son or daughter's involved in this. I know they've got an account, or adults saying, there's a lot going on out there. People are losing control, and so I started to hear more and more about that. And so the idea was, let's try to rein some of this in. And you mentioned the tax. The industry, when we brought up the tax issue, it's called an excise. It's not a tax on the bettors. The bettors don't pay it. And the industry, when they heard about it, said, oh, they're trying to tax you, the bettors. Typical Massachusetts, they're trying to put another tax in place. What we're looking to do is to have the companies pay more in taxes. So when there are several states surrounding Massachusetts where the companies pay 51% excise. In Massachusetts, it's 20%. And in those other states, New York's one of them, they still have a very robust sports betting environment. And so we're saying if they're getting 51% in those states, we should be getting that here as well. And that's funds that we can use to help us address some of the harms that the industry is creating.
Wouldn't that sort of make it worse though? At the same time, you're taxing more on the betting organizations, right? Wouldn't that entice them to want to bring in more people, make them advertise more and stuff? So wouldn't that kind of make it worse?
That's a good point. And it's also will they try to expand the number of people that they're reaching, and will they pass that cost on to the bettors? And what we've seen in other states is that they have pretty much stuck to their regular path in terms of advertising and try to entice people, and that they have not passed that cost on. In New York, I think it was, they tried to put a surcharge on bets. So if New York was charging the company more, and the company then wanted to surcharge the bettor, and they backed off from that immediately. And so they have not passed that cost on, and there hasn't been any real big difference in who they're targeting or how much they're targeting somebody.
All right. My next question, do you think the state rushed into legalizing sports betting without thinking through the consequences?
Yes. And I will say that it came to the legislature, it came to the Senate floor. If it had gone to a roll call vote, meaning where our name is called and we vote yes or no, I would have voted yes. We did not have a roll call vote. It passed, ultimately, there was a roll call vote early on, but then ultimately it passed on what they call a voice vote, where the presiding officer just says all those in favor say aye, opposed no, the ayes have it, it's passed. I would have voted yes, because just as you say, we didn't know as much about it as we should have. There was a general sense that it's occurring. People betting in the black market. It's growing in popularity. We should try to rein it in, regulate it, and try to protect people. So we tried to rein it in and regulate it to protect people. And the industry, because we didn't do it right, the industry has just taken off. So if I had to vote over, I would vote no. And the only way you would get me to vote yes would be if the things that we're pushing in this bill were in place, then I may have voted yes. But that might even be questionable now given the practices of the industry. But I wish we had more understanding and more awareness. But the idea was it's happening, it's black market. If we don't regulate, it's going to spin out of control. We're losing tax money on that. Why don't we bring it in, regulate it, tax it? And that's what we did. And we could use the revenue within our budget. That's what we did. We should have gone more slowly, and we should have put in place the things that we're looking to put in place now. We're not banning it, but just put the guardrails in place.
All right, thank you. My next topic, so I put out a form when I announced this interview so that people can submit their own questions. I did that when I hosted the Candidates Night. I like when I'm dealing with, like town politics and stuff like that, I like to make sure that citizens' voices are heard. So the next questions are just going to be questions from people in Massachusetts that submitted to that form.
Sure.
The first one is, can you explain why some communities like Rockland still face serious issues with water quality? Will you advocate for funding or grants to help these towns secure safe, clean water for all residents?
Yeah, that's a great question because I've got a few towns in my district that are struggling with water. Quincy is on the MWRA system, so the water is plentiful, safe, and they're also hooked up to a sewer system through the MWRA. We've got Braintree and Holbrook in my district. Randolph's an adjacent community. They're building a new water treatment plant, and so they're on a path towards getting more safer water quality and more water. Abington and Rockland struggle both from a sewer and a water supply. Hanover struggles. Hanover is mostly on wells and on sewage system, septic systems, so they're kind of different even than some of the other communities. So yes, we are constantly trying to get funding in place for grants, for low interest or no interest loans to help communities with their water issues. There's been some talk about bringing the MWRA system down into this area. It's an expensive undertaking, but there's more and more interest in that. In the meantime, we're trying to provide as much grant money as possible to address the supply of water and the quality, particularly because of PFAS levels, which are the forever chemicals that they're finding in the water supplies. We have had money available in different communities to dredge the reservoirs, their water supply areas, to dredge those to make them deeper, to make the catchment area a little bit bigger. Put regulations in place to make sure that the watersheds are maintained as best as possible. That's meaning the rain may fall in the woods around a pond or reservoir. You want to make sure that those areas are as pristine as possible so that the water that's going into the reservoir is as clean as possible. So we have all kinds of grants programs for them. But I would say, as I have on a lot of things, it's not enough. Water is expensive, and I know in my communities that the water quality has been a real challenge. And then here, for instance, it's pretty regularly there's water restrictions on use of water.
We just had a water boil in effect because they found high amounts of E. coli.
Exactly.
This is another reason, residents in this town are, upset because they're paying all this money for water that they're not supposed to be drinking, bathing in, but, that's kind of the only source that a lot of people have,
Exactly. Yeah, and even if you're told, and here, I can't remember how long the order was in place, but for several days. So then you really want, okay, I know I can't drink it, but is it safe to shower in it? And I know a lot of people had those questions. I was following it and in touch with town officials. That was one of the questions is, can I shower in it? What if it goes in my mouth when I'm showering? What if it goes in my ears? Am I going to get an infection in my ears? So there was all those types of questions. And so you realize how important it is. That was kind of a one-off, not a systemic issue. By that means it's not a constant issue, but it occurred, and it should be a red flag that all that has to be monitored as closely as possible. And it just indicates that the water and sewer systems in these towns have to be upgraded. I toured the sewage plant, the sewage facility, not that long ago, and it's old. And I know that they're under a federal order as to how much they can treat and discharge, and so there's discussion about, do you do a better job with the pipes in the town, making sure that they're not leaking, making sure that things are not flowing into, like rainwater is not flowing into the sewage pipes that then lead into the treatment plant and overburden the treatment plant. So there's that infrastructure work that has to be done. There are some infrastructure funds available for that. And then there's ultimately a decision will have to be made about the plant itself relative to the sewage plant going forward. So water and sewer, huge issues in every town. We try to do the best we can. There's talk about bringing the MWRA into some of the communities, and then in a tax package that we passed not that long ago, and this switches over to the sewer side, which ties into the water a bit, there are tax exemptions or tax credits available to people when they're replacing or upgrading their septic systems. So we try to do it in those ways.
I'm just going to backtrack here for a moment. What do you mean by federal order, like the plants under?
Yeah, so the federal government sometimes determines exactly how much, what's the capacity of for instance, a sewer treatment plant, and what the quality of the discharge has to be, and then how much discharge can be released, particularly if it's going into a waterway. And so, for instance, here in Rockland, ultimately the discharge makes its way down into the North River through a creek, and then it makes its way down the North River. And so the federal government has some say as to the quality of the product that's coming out of the sewage treatment plant has to meet certain standards, because they know it's going to go into these sensitive habitats, ultimately into the North River, ultimately out into the ocean. And so they set those guidelines. And my recollection is that Rockland has a permit that limits how much discharge they have, and so they have to be mindful of that. And so to try to keep that under control, you kind of go back in the system and say, if we can keep water, like rainwater, out of our sewer pipes, then the treatment plant doesn't have to treat that rainwater, it just treats sewage, and that keeps the amount of what they have to treat down and makes the system work better. And so, yeah, the federal government does have a role in discharge and also has a role in water quality.
Based on your experience, can you explain the difference between state leadership and countrywide leadership?
I'd like to think in the state we get along a whole lot better than they do at the federal level. At the State House, and I can speak personally in the Senate, we work really well with our Republican counterparts. We don't agree on everything, but the debate is cordial and respectful. I know when I have legislation, I always reach out to my Republican partners in the legislature and say, hey, I've got this idea, I've got this bill, what do you think? And I'll sit down with them. I'll sit down with Democrats and Republicans with the idea that both can have interesting perspectives and may want to contribute to the bill. So I do that all the time, and I think that's the general practice in the Senate, that the Republicans and Democrats get along pretty well. It's usually constructive debate, constructive conversation, and usually there's a willingness to have Republicans and Democrats participate in bills.
That's what matters, right?
Yeah.
As long you can disagree on things, but as long as you're respectful and
Exactly.
you're cordial, that's you can get things done better that way.
Yeah, and it's the same in the House. In the House of Representatives, the Republicans and Democrats get along pretty well. In my district, Rep. DeCoste and I share representation of Rockland and Hanover, and Representative Sullivan Almeida and we share representation of Abington. So I work with two Republican state reps. I consider them friends. We get along really well, and we don't agree on everything. We have different politics, different perspectives, but we probably agree on more than we disagree on, and there's always a willingness that we talk things out, and when it comes to the towns, we're all on the same page. We're representing the town, and it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. If there's a need for more funding for the schools, for streets and sidewalks, water and sewer, doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, we agree on working together to get those resources. Washington doesn't operate that way.
In your opinion, why do basic living costs like food, housing, and utilities feel so high right now? And what can be done at the state level to make life more affordable for residents?
Well, we talked about housing a little bit. We just do not have enough housing units. We just don't have enough. And as a result, housing costs are really high. And so we're trying to find ways to encourage more building, respecting that communities want certain levels of density. They don't want, small towns don't want to be like big cities, and so we respect that, but we have to recognize that we need more housing. We are losing young people from Massachusetts. Our population's growing a little bit, but the 20s, 30s group is moving away. And I always use one of my sons as an example. He lives in Nashville, and the cost of living there is so much cheaper than it is here, and particularly when it comes to housing. The housing costs down there are so much lower than what they are here. So we've got to provide more housing, and so that those costs, again, at least stabilize and then don't increase as they have been over the years. We also face a real issue with the shortage of workforce. We struggle to find people to work in early education. And so if you're a young person and you have a child and you have to work, either a single parent or if it's two parents in a household, trying to figure out how they're going to cover the child care costs. Child care costs here can be $20,000, $24,000, $25,000 a year, depending on the number of days that you send a child to child care. And so that's really expensive, and part of that is driven by us not having enough early educators to fill these slots. In my district, there are a lot of child care providers who have the space to take in more young children, but they don't have the personnel to do it. The YMCA, for instance, is always facing that struggle. Some of the other early childhood educators are facing the same thing. And so as a result, the competition is there, and so prices go up. The other one driver is healthcare costs. And this is not unique to Massachusetts, but healthcare costs are expensive here and across the country. And so, again, how do you have somebody, people pay their healthcare cost through private insurers and maybe not get the coverage that they want? It's very expensive. And it's expensive here in Massachusetts because we do have pretty good access, but a lot of it is driven by the teaching hospitals, and that's an expensive way to deliver health care. So try to address that. We are looking to have more nurse practitioners, more physician's assistants out in some of the more rural areas where access to health care is more difficult. So it's really a supply and demand. We have a great demand for housing. We have a great demand for transportation. We have a great demand for child education, education as a whole, and trying to supply that is expensive. Is very expensive. There's nursing facilities here where you just can't get people to do those jobs, and as a result, then that impacts cost and the ability to provide those services.
When you were talking about how people are 20s and 30s moving out, I've definitely seen driving around town here, there are a lot more for sale signs outside of houses and stuff. People are just moving out of the state because it's just so expensive. But do you think, correct me if I'm wrong, but would businesses also help take the taxes down too, or no? That's more of a small town kind of thing.
No, they do. I mean, in a lot of towns, business properties are taxed higher than residential properties. In some places, twice as much. For instance, in Quincy, if you have two lots side by side, one has residential structure and one has a business structure, the business is paying twice the property tax of the residential. And so we have to find the right balance so that taxes aren't so high on businesses that they decide to leave. I met with, when they were talking about having the fair share amendment or the millionaire's tax here in Massachusetts, there was a lot of concern that would drive people out of the state. And I talked to a person second in hierarchy at a major corporation in my district. And I asked, do you think the millionaire's tax will drive people out of Massachusetts? And his response was, it might drive some people. And he said, look at me. He goes, I do pretty well here. It's not going to drive me out of the state. What matters most to me is an educated, hardworking workforce. So that's what will keep businesses here. And so his take was you have to invest in education and give the people the tools that they need to become workers that are attractive then to businesses who want to stay in the area, who then pay substantial amounts of taxes. And then and so paying them good wages is key, but in terms of keeping them there. Educating them is important for the business. The business then reciprocates by paying good wages. And then we've got to figure out a way that those wages are sufficient enough to cover childcare, to cover housing, to cover transportation, all those things. We didn't talk much about transportation, but that's another big thing when it comes to the workforce, is making sure people can get from point A to B for work or from A to B for to go shopping, for a medical appointment, whatever it may be, and that's been a challenge as well.
Finally, what advice would you give to a young person who's interested in entering politics or public service in Massachusetts?
If they're real young, meaning if they're still in school, I would say get involved in school, like you're doing. Get involved in whether it's student government, sports teams, arts, music, that include music. Just get involved. And you'll find that by getting involved, it's personally rewarding. You feel like you're part of something that's bigger than just yourself. And that's ultimately what government is all about, is serving, knowing that you're part of something that's bigger than yourself, and you're contributing to the bigger group. So if you're in school and you're involved in these extracurriculars, you're doing it, because you enjoy it, but you're also doing it, and it's making a better school environment. It's making the school better. People know each other better. They get along better as a result of it. And that's the same in government. If people want to serve in government, the idea is that government and serving people is bigger than yourself, and you want to do it to make a better place for all. So if young people get involved, if they're in school activities, that's a great way to kind of understand that dynamic. If they're out of school, then it's just getting involved in your community, whether the community has a cleanup day or they have a food pantry that helps people. You find that when you go there, again, it's personally rewarding, and it's personally rewarding because you get a sense that you're helping people. And if you get that and you understand that you can have an impact, then sometimes government is the logical next step, that you go in it with the idea that you want to help people. And you've seen it work when you're in school, when you're in the community, helping the community, and now you have a chance in government to reach even a broader group.
That is all the questions that I have for you today, Senator. Is there anything that we didn't get to discuss today that you would like to discuss, or anything that you would like voters to know?
No, I think the final comments would be, one, thank you. Great job. I don't know if I could have done this at your age. I'm not so sure I can even do it at my age. But thank you for doing it. And just I convey that I really enjoy my work. It's an honor to represent the people of Rockland and everybody in the Norfolk and Plymouth district. And I will tell you that we talk a lot in the office about what's going on nationally and the challenges that we face at the state. And I would tell you that every time I go out and do something like this with young people, I just tend to be so much more optimistic about the future. We've got some real challenging times ahead of us. But every time I go to a school, no matter what town it's in, and meet with students, engage in things like this, I walk out thinking, we can't mess it up. We've got to try not to mess it up so badly that there's nothing left. But if we can keep things on track to some degree, when the next generation comes along, I think we're going to be in a lot better shape. I just pretty excited about the role that young people play. They're going to have to play a big role, and I think they're up to the challenge. And I always feel better doing this. So and meeting students. So thanks for doing it.
Yeah, thank you for coming out. I appreciated that you're looking nice in the suit. You must be very hot in that suit. It's pretty hot outside.
Fewer and fewer people wearing suits these days. So it's like a uniform for me.
Yeah. Thank you for watching this episode of the Bulldog Breakdown. It was a very fun and exciting episode. I had a pleasure talking to Senator Keenan. Make sure to follow all my socials, and I'll see you in the next episode.